The first time he raised his voice at me, I dropped a plate. It didn't break, it just spun on the wooden floor, around and around, while he stood over me in the kitchen, face red, Bible open on the table behind him, telling me what a wife was supposed to be. I was 19 years old. We had been married 4 months. And I remember thinking very clearly, very calmly, this is the rest of my life. The bishop had told us at our wedding that a husband leads and a wife follows. I just hadn't understood yet what the word lead actually meant inside the walls of an Amish home. Stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you about what Amish husbands are permitted to do to wives who step out of line is going to disturb you. And if you grew up in a world where obedience was confused with love, it's going to feel familiar in a way that hurts. Before I tell you what happened, I want you to understand something about the world where I was raised. People from the outside often see the horses. They see the buggies. They see the black dresses and the prayer coverings. They see quiet roads and white farmhouses. What they do not see are the rules that live inside people. In our community, there was something called the Ordnung. The Ordnung was not written down. You could not hold it in your hands. But everybody knew it. Children knew it. Parents knew it. The bishop knew it. And wives learned it very quickly. I was taught from the time I was little that a good Amish woman was humble. She was quiet. She did not seek attention. She did not challenge authority. We used a word called Gelassenheit. It meant yielding, letting go of your own will, putting the community before yourself, putting others before yourself, putting God before yourself. As a little girl, it sounded beautiful. As a wife, it felt different. I grew up in Lancaster County. Our farm sat beside a narrow road lined with cornfields. In the summer, the air smelled like hay and warm earth. In the winter, wood smoke drifted from every chimney. I shared a room with my sisters. We stitched quilts by lantern light. We helped our mother can vegetables in the kitchen. Nobody talked about marriage very much. It was simply expected. One day you were a daughter, then you became a wife, and after that, a mother. That was the path. Nobody asked whether it was the path you wanted. I met my husband at church singings. He was older than me, quiet, hard-working, the kind of man parents approved of, the kind of man bishops praised. When he asked to court me, everyone seemed pleased, so I was pleased too. I thought that was what happiness looked like. I didn't know then how little I understood about the person I was marrying. The first months were not terrible. That is important to say. If they had been terrible from the beginning, I might have recognized what was happening. Instead, everything arrived slowly, like winter. You do not notice the first cold morning. Then one day the ground is frozen. The first correction came over something small. Almost every correction did. A different flower. A visit that lasted too long. A question asked at the wrong moment. A sentence spoken with the wrong tone. I learned that there were invisible lines everywhere, and I was expected to know where they were. If I crossed one, the atmosphere in the house changed immediately. The room felt colder. The silence felt heavier. His face changed. At first, he rarely shouted. He did not need to. A disappointed look could ruin an entire day. A single sentence could stay in my head for weeks. You should know better. A godly wife would not do that. Why must you always make things difficult? I began apologizing before he even finished speaking. I thought that meant I was becoming a better wife. Now I understand it meant I was becoming afraid. There are things about fear that people do not talk about. Fear does not always feel dramatic. Sometimes it feels practical. Sometimes it feels responsible. Sometimes it feels like trying very hard not to make mistakes. I spent years trying not to make mistakes. By the second year of our marriage, I measured every word before I spoke. I thought carefully before asking questions. I rehearsed conversations in my head. I worried about tiny things. How much butter I used. How long I spent hanging laundry. Whether supper would be ready on time. whether I sounded respectful enough. I was exhausted all the time. Not from the work. Amish women are used to work. I was exhausted from watching myself. One afternoon, I went to visit my mother. It was only a few miles away. I stayed longer than I planned. We were snapping green beans on the porch, talking about ordinary things. For a few hours, I felt like myself again. When I returned home, he was sitting at the kitchen table, waiting. He asked where I had been. I told him. He asked why I stayed so long. I told him. Then he looked at me and said something I never forgot. A married woman belongs with her husband. Not angry, not loud, just certain. That certainty frightened me more than shouting ever could, because certainty leaves no room for discussion, no room for explanation, no room for you. I began seeing less of my family after that, not because anyone ordered me to stop, at least not directly. It simply became easier not to go, easier not to invite criticism, easier not to create conflict. That is how isolation works. It does not always arrive as a locked door. Sometimes it arrives as 100 small pressures. Each one seems insignificant, until one day you realize your world has become very small. What the outside world doesn't see is how much power can exist inside silence. In our community, appearances mattered. People noticed everything. Who attended church, who missed church, who seemed cheerful, who seemed troubled. Women became experts at looking fine. I certainly did. I smiled when I was supposed to smile. I nodded when I was supposed to nod. I carried food to church meals. I attended quilting circles. I sat beside my husband in the buggy. And everybody assumed everything was normal. Sometimes I would stand at the wash line hanging clothes, the wind moving through the sheets, the sky bright above me, and I would have this strange feeling, like I was watching my own life from far away. Like the person everyone saw was not really me. I never said those thoughts out loud. I didn't even admit them to myself. Because once you name something, you have to face it, and I was not ready to face it. I was taught that marriage required sacrifice. I believed that. I still believe relationships require sacrifice. But sacrifice and surrender are not the same thing. Nobody explained the difference, not to me. Not to most Amish girls I knew. The older women told us marriage was hard. They told us husbands could be stubborn. They told us to pray, to be patient, to stay faithful. What nobody explained was what to do when patience changed nothing. What to do when prayer changed nothing. What to do when every year felt smaller than the year before. I remember one night lying awake beside him, the house completely quiet. The clock ticking downstairs, moonlight coming through the curtains. I stared at the ceiling for hours, and a thought came into my mind. A thought so frightening that I pushed it away immediately. What if this never changes? I tried not to think it, but it kept returning, again and again. What if this never changes? That question followed me everywhere, into the kitchen, into the barn, into church, into bed. And slowly, without realizing it, I began looking at my life differently. Not as something temporary, not as a difficult season, but as something that might last forever. That realization was the beginning of everything. I didn't know it then. I only knew that something inside me had started waking up. Quietly, carefully, like a candle being lit in a dark room. And once a light appears, even a small one, it becomes impossible to forget the darkness around it. This is my story. Like, share, and subscribe if you want to hear more real Amish experiences no one else is telling. I wish I could tell you that once I began asking myself those questions, everything became clear. It didn't. Most people imagine that when someone realizes something is wrong, they immediately leave. That was not my experience. The truth is much quieter than that. The truth is that I stayed. I stayed because leaving did not feel real. Leaving was something other people did. People whispered about those women. People shook their heads when their names came up. People prayed for them. Sometimes they stopped saying their names altogether. In our community, leaving was not a choice. It was a warning. a story told to keep everyone else in line. I knew one woman who had left years earlier. I never met her. I only knew the stories. People said she had been led astray. People said she had chosen pride. People said the world had gotten hold of her. Nobody ever asked why she left. That question was never part of the conversation. I think about that now. How strange it is that everyone wanted to judge the decision, but nobody wanted to understand the reason. By the 3rd year of my marriage, the house felt different. Not because the walls had changed, because I had changed. I was beginning to notice things I once ignored. The way my husband spoke to me in front of others. The way he corrected me over small details. The way every disagreement somehow became evidence that I was failing as a wife. I kept searching for the version of him I had married, the gentle version, the smiling version, the man who had seemed so steady during our courtship. Sometimes I found him. That was the hardest part. There would be weeks when everything seemed normal. We would share meals together, work side by side, talk about crops, talk about weather, talk about family. And I would convince myself that things were getting better. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe this was simply what marriage looked like. Then something small would happen. A forgotten chore, a misplaced tool, an opinion he didn't like. And everything would return. The criticism, the coldness, the anger. I began living from one good week to the next, waiting for evidence that things were changing. The evidence never lasted. Nobody told me that hope can sometimes keep you trapped. Not because hope is bad, because hope keeps convincing you to wait a little longer. Just one more month, just one more season, just one more year. I became very good at waiting. In our community, women learn how to endure. We learn it young. We endure long days, hard work, childbirth, loss, disappointment. Endurance is treated almost like a virtue, and sometimes it is. But endurance can also become a cage, especially when you stop asking whether the thing you are enduring should exist at all. There are things I remember with painful clarity. One winter evening, the sound of sleet hitting the windows, a kerosene lamp burning on the table, the smell of soup simmering on the stove. I remember standing there while he listed all the ways I had disappointed him that week. I cannot even remember most of the reasons. That is what strikes me now. The reasons were forgettable. The feeling was not. I remember feeling smaller with every sentence, as if I were slowly disappearing, as if the person called Martha was being erased and replaced by someone whose only purpose was avoiding mistakes. When I look back now, I realize something important. Control rarely begins with commands. It begins with self-doubt. If someone can make you doubt your own judgment, they do not have to control every decision. You will begin controlling yourself. I watched that happen to me, slowly, year after year. I stopped trusting my instincts. I stopped trusting my feelings. I stopped trusting my own memory. If I remembered an argument one way, and he remembered it another way, I assumed he was right. If something felt unfair, I told myself I was being selfish. If something hurt, I told myself I was being weak. I became a stranger to myself. What the outside world doesn't see is that many Amish women carry enormous burdens in silence. Not because they have no thoughts, not because they have no opinions, because they know the cost of speaking them aloud. I knew women who cried only when they were completely alone, women who smiled through heartbreak, women who carried grief like stones in their aprons, women who believed suffering was simply part of being faithful. I do not judge them. I was one of them. My mother was one of them too. I understand that now. For years, I wondered why she never said more, why she never asked harder questions, why she never pulled me aside and told me I deserved better. Then I got older, and I began seeing her differently. I began noticing the tiredness in her eyes, the way she carefully chose her words, the way she looked over her shoulder before discussing certain things. I realized she had been raised inside the same system. She had inherited the same beliefs, the same fears, the same limits. One afternoon, I visited her during canning season. The kitchen was hot. Steam covered the windows. Rows of jars sat cooling on the counter. She was slicing peaches. I was peeling apples. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then she quietly asked me if everything was all right at home. The question surprised me, not because of the words, because of the way she asked them, carefully, almost fearfully. I looked at her. She looked at me. And for a moment, I thought about telling her everything. The loneliness, the fear, the exhaustion, the things I carried every day. But the words never came. I simply nodded. She nodded back, and we continued working. I think about that moment often. Two women sitting a few feet apart, both knowing something, neither able to say it. There are things silence protects. There are also things silence destroys. By the 7th year of my marriage, something had changed inside me. Not outside, inside. I was no longer trying to convince myself everything was fine. That stage was over. The questions had become impossible to ignore. The future no longer felt endless. It felt urgent. I began noticing possibilities. Small ones. Tiny cracks in the wall I had spent years staring at. I started paying attention when people mentioned former Amish women. I listened carefully when someone talked about life outside the community. I stored information away. Names, places, stories. I never told anyone what I was doing, not even myself. It felt dangerous, almost sinful, yet I could not stop. Part of me had begun searching for a door, even before I knew I wanted to walk through it. One evening, I stood alone in the barn after chores were finished. The horses were quiet. The air smelled of hay and leather. Sunlight filtered through the wooden boards. Dust floated in golden beams. I remember standing there completely still, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a different life. Not a perfect life, just a different one. A life where I could make choices. A life where I could speak without fear. A life where every decision was not filtered through someone else's approval. The thought frightened me. It also felt like breathing after being underwater too long. I did not know then how close everything was to changing. I did not know that a single night would soon force a decision I had spent years avoiding. I did not know that the world I had always known was about to fall away beneath my feet. I only knew that something inside me was no longer asleep. And once that part of you wakes up, it becomes impossible to silence forever. This is my story. Like, share, and subscribe if you want to hear more real Amish experiences no one else is telling.